Okay, welcome everybody. I'm here with Claire Sommers, who is the postdoctoral fellow of early modern British literature in the English department at Washington University in St. Louis. Her current book project, Chimeras, Centaurs, and Satyrs, Creating Mixed Genre Texts in Antiquity and the Renaissance, argues that authors would use mythological figures such as the chimera or chimera.
I always say chimera, but I have heard it
Chimera,
both ways.
okay.
I think in
Chimera,
French it's chimère, that's why.
feel free to correct me. My Greek and Latin is
No,
not all that great.
you're good.
Or the satyr to symbolize the composite nature of their works and to demonstrate that hybridity is the means of transcending existing forms of expression. Her article on the role of the shadows in Plato's cave was recently published in Arion. Claire was the creator and founding director of the Critical Theory Certificate at the Graduate Center of CUNY. She currently serves as the exhibits and professionalization coordinator of the Northeast Modern Language Association and the advisor to WashU's chapter of the English Honor Society, Sigma Tau Delta. So I mentioned the article, which is what we're going to be talking about, and I just reread it, and there's very, very interesting stuff in here. So what we're going to do is focus on, Clara, your article, The Return to Plato's Cave. And so there's not much to preface it other than this is sort of the quintessential sort of initiation for any philosopher into paideia, right? That they have to go through the allegory and they come out of it with all kinds of different interpretations. And so we're here for you to walk us through or to shed some light on or shadow
Very nice.
on Plato's allegory of the cave.
Yes.
So,
So I think the starting point for this particular allegory, and as you said, this is one of the foundational, probably the most famous philosophical passage in Western literature. This is, really the foundation of philosophy. And so often there's a focus on the ascent from the cave to go towards the light. And we all know what happens in the allegory, right? Just to recap it. You have prisoners who are chained up in the cave. They look at the wall, they see shadows. One of them somehow manages to get free, turns around, sees the fire, and then slowly makes his ascent up to the cave and looks around him and eventually sees the objects around him on the surface and the sun and the good and all of that. And the whole allegory has been interpreted as we need to understand that what we're seeing is only a shadow or an imitation of an ideal form. And so most of the scholarship and most of the work on this allegory has been focusing on the idea of light and seeing things in their true form. But one of the most striking aspects of the allegory for me has always been that the fact that once the prisoner makes it up to the surface, he's all happy, he's basking in the sun, he's thrilled, he's told he has to go back down into the cave in order to rescue and teach others. And he not only has to go in there to teach, but he has to actually learn to see in the dark and see in the shadows. And to me, that gives the shadows a much more prominent place and a sense of importance that I think has not been discussed as much. And so for me, the question became, well, why do we have to go back in the cave? Why do we have to understand the shadows? And that was really the starting point for this article, is what do shadows give us that we can't even get with the light? So I started thinking about the shadows and this idea of language taking place in the dark, taking place in obscurity. And, if you think about it, that is what education is taking people from obscurity, from darkness into light. And I was reading one of Plato's other dialogues called the Cratylus, and found a possible reason that the shadows have such prominence in Plato's Republic. the way that education occurred in Plato's time and the way that we learn now is really not different. I mean, we're talking about over 2,000 years, and we still really learn the same way now that we did in ancient Greece. And this is true whether we're on Zoom, whether we're in the classroom. Primarily, we have to teach through language, right? No matter what, there needs to be words, there needs to be talking in order for there to be some kind of communication. So Cratylus is Plato's dialogue all about language. And he talks, or logos, and he talks about logos as being comprised of something called stoicheia. And this is a Greek word that can have a few different definitions. And it is sometimes translated as elements and thought to mean letters and phonetic sounds and that kind of thing. But if you go back into the original origin of that word, it actually means the shadow cast by a sundial. Mm-hmm. And that is just such an evocative image, because if you look at it, if you're trying to tell time using a sundial, how do you do that? You look at the shadow and you measure the shadow. The only way to gain knowledge looking at the sundial, you don't stare directly at the sun. That's not good for you. You stare at the shadow. So this idea of learning to see in the shadows and this idea of looking to the shadows is a very important one for Plato. He understands that language is something very inexact, that it is often hard to communicate through language. And we must remember that there are shadows and there are uncertainties. And it's only by investigating these uncertainties that we can become enlightened and educated.
That's such an interesting point. So if I understand correctly, the mere fact of our cave protagonist, seeing the sun, naming, oh, that's the sun.
Yeah.
And even if he can talk about what the sun is about, let's say he can even scientifically explicate the physical properties of how the sun glows or whatever, he doesn't get to the form. He doesn't get to the truth by virtue of the fact that he's naming.
Exactly.
Which is
exactly. And that was really the Cratylus. That was the entire conclusion, is that investigating names will not actually get you any closer to knowledge. And this is a challenge of language. And this is why Plato, I always laugh when he talks and he rails against the poets, because Plato is probably the biggest poet of them all. Every time he needs to explain something, it's like, I'm going to give you an icon. I'm going to give you an image. I'm going to give you an allegory or a metaphor, because he understands that language is something that is imprecise. So he gives us these allegories. He gives us these images, forcing us to dissect them and really peer inside, to look into the shadows, look into those obscurities, and figure out what's being said.
And so it must have been really frustrating for your average Athenian in terms of, when dealing with Socrates, when he was embodying the sort of practice that you're talking about, sort of throwing shadow on on what's true. Well, but what if we thought about this one? Just going around and around and around.
I've always joked that I can't even imagine being married to Socrates, because he did have a wife. I mean, could you just imagine trying to make breakfast for him? What would you like for breakfast? What does breakfast mean to you? Well, would you like eggs? Tell me, is the egg a metaphor for the world? Can we see the world in the egg? I mean, could you imagine just trying to get breakfast on the table with him in the morning?
No. And for in a very concrete way, looking at learning in college and being a student or being an instructor, that can be frustrating when we encounter the fact that words have more than one meaning, truth has more than one meaning. They can be hybrid. I'd like to also circle back to, you mentioned Heidegger. This is all the play on all these, on light.
Yes.
The idea that the eyes, so you talk about Heidegger making the point that when he was reading this, that, the sun projects to us, brings us to the forms of truth. but also the eyes are like the sun,
Yeah,
and the eyes take in, but they also project light.
exactly.
What can you comment on that? Or I just found that really interesting, and sort of, what that, when you read into that.
Absolutely. I think with Heidegger, he focused a lot on the light imagery, but this idea of the eye as light, it's again, we're not looking for some kind of external objects. It's not like we're trying to go up to the surface and just look at a sun. If we think of the eye as projecting a form of light, then once again, it's incumbent upon us to examine and figure out what is going on. We're never really, with Plato, we're never really looking for something that's outside of ourselves. It's always about, how can I explain to people that they need to constantly examine and constantly question everything that they're seeing, that it's always about questioning. And I think that's a big reason that Plato has such an issue with poets and painters, as he discusses in book 10 of the Republic.
Right.
The word he uses all the time is, he says that they only paint or portray things as they appear. And the word he uses is the Greek word phenetai. And that prefix is associated with light. So it's this idea of bringing to light.
Mm-hmm.
Plato isn't interested in an art that is going to bring everything to light and show us everything and give off the idea that if we look at this, we will be enlightened and we will know everything. The cornerstone of Socrates is, I am wise because I know nothing. So
Mm-hmm.
there always has to be some kind of impetus to continue the search, to keep looking deeper, to keep probing into the obscurities.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what the Heidegger quote really shows us, is that it's always about, enlightenment comes from continuing to examine and continuing that process.